Hold it. Drop the bag and don't say a word.
When are you gonna grow up, kid? You know, if your old man finds out about this, he's gonna kick the...
That'll be 83 cents. I said that'll be 83 cents. 50 cents for the celery juice.
Aren't you going to get it?
I thought you were going to get it.
I don't care which one of you gets it, so long as I get the 83 cents.
I got it yesterday.
Yesterday was Sunday.
That's right. We were down in Hunter's Point.
We were at Hunter's Point Saturday.
If I don't get my money, I call a cop.
Celery juice, 50 cents. Take it out of there, will you, please?
Thank you.
We were over in the Richmond district on Saturday, remember?
Okay. Celery juice. I'm telling you, someday you're going to end up like a salad bowl.
Inspectors 8-1. Inspectors 8-1.
Inspectors 8-1.
A 217 reported at 423 Miles Avenue. Officer involved.
All right, we're on our way. Come on, hit it.
I was on the corner of Miles and Wheeler on a 518 when this 217 came through. I was here in less than 2 minutes.
And Officer Fletcher was still conscious when you got here?
Yes, sir. It was like he wouldn't let go until someone got here, and then he said what he had to say.
And what was that?
Suitcase. The leather suitcase.
That's it?
Yes, sir.
What about the other man?
Name of Barrett. Duke Barrett. He was dead when I arrived, shot once, close range.
Did you know him?
No, sir. There was close to $500 in his wallet and a very expensive digital watch still on his wrist, so I don't think the motive was robbery.
Unless all the shooting scared the killer away.
Or unless Barrett had something valuable in that leather suitcase. I want to talk to the coroner before he leaves.
How's Barrett?
He's dead.
The money?
It's gone. I covered his route, just to see what Barrett was carrying. Comes to a little over $250,000.
$250,000.
Whoever hit Barrett, Mr. McGuire, must have known something. He waited until Barrett had made the last pickup. He chose the best possible spot along the whole route for a heist. And he picked a day when he knew Barrett would be carrying a lot of money.
Yeah, it's an inside job. Well, who do we know that's that crooked?
Everybody.
And who do you know that's that stupid? It's dumb. It's really dumb.
It's so dumb it's nearly smart.
What was the name of the last fellow that ran that route for us?
Pulaski.
No, Pulaski. Pulaski. Talk to him.
He's number 2 on my list.
And Eddie Marks. He's ambitious. Talk to him. Larry Baker, Jimmy Tatum.
He's in Detroit.
Well, the planes fly both ways. And you might as well check me out, too. In case anybody asks.
I already have, Mr. McGuire. You were number 1 on my list. Somebody did ask. Mr. McGuire, how long has it been since you've seen your son?
Why? What makes you think of him?
You said, who do you know who's that stupid?
All right. Check out Ronnie, too.
That's right. They were both shot with the same gun. 38 caliber. I've got it. Thanks. What did you get?
Barrett, he's got a rap sheet as long as your list of commendations. Mostly numbers, making book, nothing violent. Talked to Vice, and they think he might have been carrying a bag from McGuire, collecting from the local bookies.
Frank McGuire?
West Coast representative for the syndicate.
Well, don't say it unless you can prove it.
Which means that suitcase might be full of money.
I know a guy who used to work for McGuire. Let's talk to him.
Why not go straight to McGuire?
Because McGuire would tell you that a book is something that he gets from a library. Come on.
How you doing?
Hello, Pulaski. Get in. You hear what happened to Barrett?
Who's Barrett?
He's the reason a cop was shot.
Why come to me? I didn't do it. I was working right here when he got hit.
What time was that?
I don't know. How would I know?
Well, how do you know what time you were here when he was shot?
All right. A guy told me about it. He was here asking me about it.
Policeman?
I don't know. Just a guy.
What did you tell him?
I don't know nothing, Lieutenant. I hadn't even seen those guys since my parole. I mean, I got nothing to tell them or you.
All right. Then maybe you can tell me somebody who can.
You know Ron McGuire?
Frank McGuire's son?
Yeah, well, Frank caught him with his hand in the cookie jar. Kicked him out. He might be mad enough to tell you something.
You mean the biggest crook in San Francisco kicks his son out of the house because he's a thief? You know, there's got to be a lesson in that somewhere.
Sure. Only steal from strangers. That'll be $1.25.
Father wants to talk to you, Ronnie.
McGuire! Open up! McGuire! Stop where you are! Police! I'm gonna put on an APB. Make sure he doesn't leave.
He's not going anywhere, not with that head. What were you and McGuire fighting about?
He owed me money. I went to collect and he jumped me.
What was he carrying in the suitcase?
Clothes, I guess. Isn't that what you usually carry in a suitcase?
Do you always wear an empty holster when you go collect debts?
Is there a law against that?
Who killed Barrett?
Barrett who?
Was it Ron McGuire?
All I know about Mr. McGuire is he assaulted me. And I don't wish to press any charges. Can I go now?
You can go. Go.
You mind?
Bernard Rosino, investment counselor. You really believe other people trust him with their money?
Why not? He handled other people's money all of his life in one way or another. Homicide, Stone. Yeah, where? Okay, we're on our way. An officer saw Ron McGuire going into the federal building 30 minutes ago.
Where?
You heard me. The Attorney General's office.
The money my father gets from the books, he launders by passing through respectable businesses he controls here in San Francisco and in Los Angeles.
What are the names of the businesses?
Falcon Trucking, Stonehurst's Restaurant Supply Company, Marks and Parmel Investment Counselors. I can also give you chapter and verse on his hidden bank accounts, too.
How does it look?
I think Mr. McGuire is going to be a gold mine.
Yeah, but that all depends, you know?
All right. This is the deal. In return for your testimony before the grand jury, you'll be granted immunity from anything self-incriminating, which means the more you tell us, the better it is for you.
I want that in writing, okay? And protection. I get protection.
You'll be in the custody of Mr. Bradley and his security team. Now, they've been at it a long time. They haven't lost anyone yet.
Okay. When do we start?
Right now. And the first thing you have to learn is stay away from windows.
He matched the description in the APB right down to his shoes, all except for the suitcase.
What time was that?
12:07. He went in the Attorney General's offices, and that's the last I saw of him. All I got from people in that office was the runaround. They wouldn't even give me the time of day, so I called you.
They wouldn't, huh? Maybe they lost sight of the fact that we're both on the same side. Come on, let's remind them.
Lieutenant, sorry for the delay.
This is Inspector Robin.
Mr. Stockwood?
Well, what can I do for you?
Tell us where we can find Ron McGuire.
Who?
McGuire, Ron McGuire.
Well, he's not here.
That wasn't my question. I was asking where he was.
He's in custody, Lieutenant. Now, what's this all about?
You tell me. We're investigating a homicide.
Homicide?
Homicide. And Ron McGuire is one of the suspects. Now, one of our men saw him come in here about 30 minutes ago. Now, where is he? What's it all about?
Normal security precautions. Now, Mr. McGuire is going to testify before a special grand jury on a federal matter. At the moment, he's with one of our witness security teams at a classified location.
Which means he's using the law to hide from the law.
You'll have to explain that.
We believe that Ron McGuire robbed and killed one of his father's couriers. We are looking for him, and they are looking for him. So he comes to you to offer you some information, probably about his father's operations.
On the homicide. Do you have any proof?
No. That's why we want to talk to him.
Then you'll have to wait in line. Lieutenant, we've been trying to get something on Frank McGuire for a long time. Now, whatever his son may or may not have done, he's our first big break. I don't want anything to happen to him. You understand?
Now, you better understand me. Whoever killed that courier also shot a police officer. Now, I know you've got security problems, but they're not with us. So why don't we just hang around until you let us talk to your witness?
All right. I'll see what I can do. 2 o'clock?
How about right now?
Lieutenant.
We'll wait.
How does it look?
It was a San Francisco morning. I went around 8 times. I didn't see a thing out of place. Coffee ready?
Look at him. 8 times around the block, and he isn't even breathing hard.
That's because I'm in good shape. Don't you do any running?
Yeah, sure. I run all the time.
Mostly the fat.
Hey, Larry, here's a good line for your novel. You ought to write that one down.
Now, don't be facetious. It's not a novel. It's my doctoral dissertation.
Hey, Green, there were some nice looking donuts up there. Whose deal?
Mine? You dealt in Kansas City, right? How's Helen?
What's going on between you and my wife? Every time I see you, you ask, how's Helen? Every time I see Helen, she asks, how's David? Nobody ever asks how I am.
Who cares?
I'm fine, thanks. The kids are great. Helen's in good form. As a matter of fact, I'm thinking about picking her option up for another year.
But what are you guys doing anyway?
Playing gin rummy. You want to join us?
Aren't you supposed to be protecting me?
Well, you see, Ron, we're the night shift, and when you're safe and snug in your little bed, we'll be working, so we won't have time for gin rummy then.
You mind if I ask you a question?
No.
Your old man. Do you think he'd really try to have you killed?
Yeah?
That's heavy.
It's nothing personal. We always hated each other.
20 minutes after he leaves his apartment, my son is in the Attorney General's office. And within an hour, the AG is putting together a blue ribbon grand jury. You know what that means?
How much does he know about our operation?
Everything. Been standing at my elbow ever since he was a kid. He could ruin me.
You should have hit him when he came through the door.
Why didn't you?
He's your son, Mr. McGuire.
He's a cannibal. A cannibal. He'd eat my flesh to save himself. I called Cincinnati. There's a man on his way. But he can't do us any good until we know where my son is. You lost him, now you find him.
All right, I'll get the word out.
Rosino, tell them he's my son when he's dead. As long as he's alive, he's my enemy.
He's clean.
No reflection, Lieutenant, but we can't afford to make the same mistake once. No shakedown, no talk.
Bradley's in charge here.
Get him.
Mr. McGuire?
What's going on anyway?
These men are San Francisco officers. They want to talk to you about a homicide.
I want a lawyer.
I'm a lawyer, Mr. McGuire. Would you like me to advise you?
I don't know now.
Where were you this morning between 9 and 10?
You have the right to remain silent.
Do you know a man named Duke Barrett? At 11:40, I saw you running outside of your apartment building. I ordered you to stop and you didn't. Why? What was in that leather suitcase you were carrying?
Clothes.
You were at the Attorney General's office 20 minutes later without the suitcase. Now, what did you do with it? Come on, McGuire. Now, what did you do with it? We saw your clothes in that apartment building. What's in that bag?
Hey, what's going on here anyway, huh? Nobody told me I was going to get hassled by the locals.
You're getting argumentative, Lieutenant. Now, if there are no further questions.
All right, that's all for now. But I'm going to be waiting in line for you. And remember, they can't give you immunity for murder. If you need any help to keep him alive, fellas, just let me know. Thanks for your help.
Okay, let's move him.
You think that's necessary?
I don't like any breach of security. I told you that. We'll be at location 8 in about an hour.
He's our man.
Yep. Sure picked a convenient time to turn himself in.
He certainly did, but he's our man. Let's get a search warrant. I want to tear that boy's room apart.
Let me talk to McGuire.
Hello.
I just got in from Cincinnati. What can you tell me?
Delivery will be delayed. Where can I reach you?
You can't. I'll call back on the hour.
Yeah. This is Sims. I just saw that guy you're looking for. He's at the Senator Hotel, room 418.
A mattress, box springs, baseboard, the framing around the windows, nothing but clothes. Which means that suitcase was probably full of money. You wonder why he didn't split right away? I guess he figured he might get burned. So where would he have stashed it? He only had 20 minutes. Had to be someplace safe, a place no one would think about. Son of a gun. I thought that was gonna be in the bay.
Daniel, if they would pave the whole world with cement, people would still find a place to bury the things they'd want to hide.
I'll take the first watch in the room across the hall.
I'll relieve you at 8. Well, how much do I owe you now?
Just a tad over 300,000.
Take my marker.
May I speak with Mr. McGuire, please?
I'm sorry, you must have the wrong number. Get Green, tell him to get the car started. You cover the lobby, and look alive, we've been made.
Put it on.
Take a look here. Find anything?
Yeah, the rifle, an AR-15, probably stolen. Spent cartridge, and the guy that rents that office.
Oh, did he say anything?
He was out to lunch.
Which is lucky for him. If he'd been there, he'd be dead.
I'm sorry about your partner.
Yeah, thanks.
Is there anything we can do?
There is one thing. Just stay away from us, okay? I don't want to have to move again because of you.
All right. Let's run the serial number of that rifle through to Washington. See what they give us.
Yes, operator, I'd like to place a call to a Mr. Charles Davis at the National Criminal Information Center, Washington, D.C.
The AR-15 was stolen from an armory in Cincinnati about 4 months ago. Now, there were no prints on the rifle, the bullets, the clip, everything was wiped clean as a whistle.
All right, I want a complete list of all the hitmen in and around Cincinnati.
Right here, Mike.
Well, that didn't take long.
They had it on hand. Somebody had already called for the same information.
Somebody from here?
In the Attorney General's office.
Who?
He didn't say. I think he assumed I was with the government and said he'd already sent us that material. Told him I was San Francisco PD, and he clammed up.
You don't think Bradley's meddling in our investigation, do you?
That's exactly what I think.
Well, you've got a suspicious mind.
It's the company I keep.
You pulled pictures on these guys?
It's in the works.
All right, let's get a court order. I want to find out if McGuire Sr.'s made any calls to Cincinnati lately.
That's right. You got the wrong merchandise, so I'll have to set up another delivery date.
When?
I don't know when. It was just luck we found him the first time. So call every hour.
Better be careful what you say. They may have a tap on that line.
Huh. I don't need a tap on my phone. They've got Ronnie. I'm almost tempted to let him keep that bag of money if he'd keep his mouth shut.
Want me to put that on the street?
No. It's not my money. It just passes through my hands.
Does that bother you?
I try not to think about it.
Now, they found the gun outside of his room. It was a .38 caliber, the same type that killed Barrett. They found fingerprints on 2 of the bullets. Now, you're an attorney. You tell me, do I have enough to arrest him on?
All I'm asking you to do is wait your turn. Let me get him to the grand jury. Let me squeeze him for all the juice that's in him, and then he's yours.
There's one more thing. We went to the telephone company to find out if McGuire had made any phone calls to Cincinnati. The information was already on the desk. Someone from the Attorney General's office had already asked for it. And that someone was David Bradley.
Brian Phillips was a close friend of his, Mike. Their families were close.
He is a U.S. Marshal, and he doesn't have any investigative authority in this case. Now, listen. You straighten him out, or I will.
Here he comes.
Had McGuire made any calls to Cincinnati?
1. Turned out to be an answering service. Local police are checking it.
Mr. Stockwood, Lieutenant, what can I do for you?
Get off of our case.
What is he talking about?
A murder investigation is a local matter, Dave. It's not your jurisdiction.
I know that.
Then why are you involved?
I'm trying to protect a witness. Someone wants to kill him. I want to know who that someone is. I want to know how he works, how he thinks, as much as I can find out about him. Then I'll know what to do.
Makes sense to me.
Why, what did you think I was doing?
Looking for revenge. Now, if I'm wrong, I apologize. But if I'm right, you better stop it right here and now. When does McGuire go to the grand jury?
Tomorrow.
All right. 24 hours. When I ask for him, you deliver.
Agreed.
Have you told Helen yet?
No. I'm flying out tonight to see you. Dave, just take care of our witness. Stay out of the homicide investigation, okay?
Only one of these has a record. The others are possibles. Suspected, nothing ever proven.
Did you talk to Stockwood?
Yeah, he's flying out to see Brian's widow tonight.
Well, then we better do it quick if we're going to do it.
How do you figure on finding him?
I don't. We're gonna let him find us.
What are you guys talking about?
You better get ready. We're moving again.
Wait a minute. What's wrong with right here? Listen, every time we go out, we take the chance of me being seen.
Take your hands off me.
Okay. Okay. But I know something's going on. Ever since that guy was killed, you've been acting funny.
That guy happened to be a very good friend of mine. What did you expect me to do? Sing and dance? Throw a party? Have the girls in? Come on, let's get out of here.
Just got a twix from the Cincinnati police. They checked the answering service. Call the McGuire made was for a Harry Spellivan, that address.
And no such person at that address.
No such address. It's a vacant lot.
Where does the answering service send its bill?
They didn't. He paid 6 months in advance and sent them a check the first of every month. He was always 6 months ahead in his bill. And he set up the whole thing by phone and mail so no one ever saw him. No description. All the girls who talked to him could only tell the police one thing. He had a nice voice.
Well, don't they have a number where they can reach him?
He always checked for his messages. Tells us nothing.
Oh, now wait a minute. It tells us that McGuire made a phone call to Cincinnati to somebody who doesn't want you to know who he is or what he looks like. Tanner?
Yeah, Mike?
I want you to stake out Frank McGuire. If he meets with anyone who looks like any of these pictures, let me know.
You want me to pick him up?
If you can think of a good reason.
How about suspicion?
That's a good reason.
Hello. Hello, Mr. McGuire. The guy you're looking for is in room 502 at the Atherstone Hotel. Leave it alone.
What do you mean? You can see the whole place.
Just leave it alone and go into the next room.
You're setting him up, aren't you? And you're using me for the bait.
Will you go into the next room, please?
No. This isn't the deal we made. You can't do this to me. I want to talk to Stockwood.
As soon as he gets back to town.
Now! I want to talk to him now. You're going to get me killed.
You're still alive, and you'll stay that way as long as you do as you're told. Go into the next room and stay there. Go on. All right, gentlemen. Pull up some chairs, make yourselves comfortable.
Hold it! Don't let your finger touch that trigger.
You're under arrest. Put your hands on top of your head and straighten up. Very slowly.
You all right, Dave?
Yeah!
All right, Dave. Not a word now. Get up. Come on. Get up. Get up. Get in that room. Get into that room.
Lieutenant, and posting men up on that roof was merely a precaution.
Why did you use a room on the front and not one in the back? And why were the windows open and the shades up? And why were there 2 men up there on that roof and only 1 man in there with him?
Our security procedures.
That wasn't security procedures, that was a rat trap. And McGuire was the bait.
It caught a killer.
And another killer got away. You were supposed to keep him alive, but you didn't. You failed.
Weren't you kind of hard on him, Mike?
Hard on him? Oh, if I knew I could make it stick, I'd charge him with premeditated murder. A badge and a gun doesn't give you the right to kill. And a criminal isn't fair game just because he committed a crime.
It was self-defense, Mike.
And we're right back where we started from, looking for Ron McGuire.
Hello.
Dad?
Ronnie. Well, how are you?
Not so good. I want to make a deal.
I thought you already had a deal with the Justice Department.
That's done. It's finished. The deal I'm talking about is for $250,000.
You know, I never talk big money on the phone. Come on home. We'll talk.
You really think I am crazy, don't you? I'll tell you the deal from right here. I want $10,000, small bills, and I want a car. For that, I tell you where the suitcase is.
That's very generous. What's the matter? You having regrets?
No. I just figure I owe you for all the wonderful things you taught me.
I gave you everything.
You gave me nothing.
Goodbye, Ronnie.
No, wait, Dad. Please. I'm sorry. Man, I'm just scared. Look, as far as anybody will ever know, the money's gone with me. I mean, you can have it all. After all, it is yours. Just give me what I asked for, okay?
Why should I?
Maybe because you owe me too.
Where is it?
You remember where I fell and broke my arm when I was 14?
Yeah, I remember.
I'll meet you there in 30 minutes. Just park the car, leave the money in the glove compartment, and I'll meet you.
All right, I'll be there.
Alone?
Yeah, alone.
What are we looking for?
Ron McGuire.
What makes you think we'll find him here?
Well, he left that apartment building at about 11:45. At 5 minutes after 12, he was at the Attorney General's office. Sometime in between, a big leather suitcase with a lot of money in it disappeared, and it disappeared somewhere around here.
He probably came back last night and got it.
No, I alerted everybody in this area. They've got pictures of him. Besides, a man carrying a big leather suitcase would be easy to spot.
But there's a lot of people in this area with suitcases. There's a bus station right over there.
I know all that. Besides, I had some of our boys check out the lockers.
Inspectors 8-1. Inspectors 8-1.
Inspectors 8-1.
This is Tanner, Mike. The subject left his house about 15 minutes ago. He stopped at a bank, and then he made a stop, and he picked up another car, a blue Ford. Well, something's going down.
Where are you?
I'm on Bay Street, going west towards the bridge.
Okay, we're on our way.
Ronnie, where are you? Ronnie, where are you?
Oh, Mike, he's parked on the lower road at the Gottfried bunker, the blue Ford.
Okay, Tanner, I've got it.
Don't start the engine.
I thought we had a deal.
That's right. $10,000 in the glove compartment. I looked, but it wasn't there.
That's right. Where's the suitcase? What's this?
I checked your bag through to Los Angeles on the bus. You can find it in the baggage room in L.A.
Sure you did.
That's the baggage check. This is the ticket. San Francisco to Los Angeles. All you have to do is just give them the check, and they'll give you the bag and your money. Of course, it might cost you a couple of bucks for storage, but I'm sure you can swing that.
Look under the front seat on the passenger side. The envelope's there.
Okay. Get out and just walk away. And if you send anybody looking for me, I'm going to tell anybody who's interested that this whole thing was your idea.
Oh, I'm not going to send anybody looking for you, because they'd believe you. Just take one look and they'd know that you couldn't think up a $250,000 heist all by yourself.
What makes you think you're so much smarter than anybody else?
I don't know where you're going, but don't ever come back. If you do, I'll kill you myself.
Hold it, police! Police! Tanner, come here, take him! Inspectors 8-1, in pursuit of a late model blue Ford sedan, heading east on Bryant from 5th Street. Request intercept. Police, hold it. Cover me. Don't move that hand.
See, Ronnie and I were never really close, Lieutenant. We never really understood each other.
I have a list of all your personal property here, Mr. McGuire. If you'll just check it out carefully, sign this form, I'll let you have it.
Very well. Everything seems to be in order, I think.
Thank you very much, Mr. McGuire, and now you are under arrest.
What are you talking about?
We had the Los Angeles Police Department check the contents of that suitcase in the baggage room. It was filled with money. And you signed this form saying that that claim check belongs to you.
So I was mistaken?
Well, we have a witness here who says you aren't.
I want to call my lawyer.
Of course, be my guest.
Lieutenant, Inspector, I understand you've got Ron McGuire.
Yes, he's upstairs.
Get him. I'll meet you.
Where's Bradley?
Washington. He's been reassigned. I had to break up the team, put him in other units. They were too emotionally involved in this case. There's one lesson here. From now on, we rotate our personnel on a regular basis.
You know, there's another lesson out there in the streets. Crimes have no labels. They're not federal, they're not state, they're not city. They're just crimes against the people. And if we find we can't work together, that means we're not doing our jobs.
That can't happen to us.
What?
Getting emotionally involved. I mean, half the time, I don't even know what you're talking about.
Well, you don't have to know what I'm talking about. Just do what I'm talking about.
In the fall dim light of San Francisco, where the fog rolls like a living thing and the streets slope as if the city itself is perpetually leaning in to listen, Inspector Mike Stone moved with the quiet confidence of a man who had learned to hear what the city never said aloud. And on this particular morning of 1972, as cable cars clanged like tired bells and the bay breathed salt through alleys and open windows, the city was whispering something old, something wrong, something that felt like hunger disguised as civility, a hunger that did not belong to the poor or the desperate, but to people who had already eaten well and still wanted more. Stone stood near the curb on Vallejo Street, coat collar turned up against the cold, eyes tracing the shape of a crowd gathered too neatly around a dead man who had collapsed without ceremony, without blood or spectacle, simply folded into himself like a bad thought. And it was that quietness that bothered him most, because San Francisco crimes were usually theatrical, flamboyant, desperate to be seen. But this one had chosen to disappear into plain sight, and when Stone crouched beside the body and took in the details, the well-cut suit, the faint trace of cologne that clung to the air, the absence of struggle, he felt the city tighten around him, as if the hills themselves were holding their breath. Inspector Steve Heller arrived moments later, younger, sharper, still carrying the restless energy of a man who believed that if he moved fast enough he might outrun the uglier truths of police work, and as he knelt beside Stone, he offered the kind of observation that came too easily, that the man looked like a heart attack, maybe stress, maybe a bad night, and Stone nodded but did not agree, because the man's face held a peculiar expression, not fear exactly, not pain, but surprise. The look of someone who had discovered too late that he was no longer part of the room. The coroner would later find traces of a rare toxin, something that mimicked natural failure while hollowing the body from the inside, and Stone would think then of how cities do the same thing, how they make room by erasing quietly, but at this early hour he only felt the itch of a question forming, the sense that the city was feeding on itself again. The dead man's name was Leonard Voss, a consultant, philanthropist, patron of the arts, a man whose public life was all donation lists and gala photographs, and whose private life, as Stone would soon learn, was a locked drawer that smelled faintly of rot. The investigation began where these things always began, with polite doors and practiced smiles, with apartments that displayed wealth as if it were a kind of moral achievement, and as Stone and Heller moved through Voss's Pacific Heights residence, listening to the echo of their own footsteps on polished floors, They felt the odd sensation of being intruders not into privacy, but into a performance that had ended abruptly, leaving props behind without context. There were books arranged more for color than reading, art chosen for names rather than feeling, and in the kitchen a refrigerator stocked with food that looked untouched, as though eating were an obligation rather than a pleasure, and Stone lingered there longer than necessary, noticing how little of the apartment suggested appetite, how the space felt consumed without ever being satisfied. Interviews followed, each one a variation on the same theme: acquaintances who praised Voss's generosity while offering no memory of warmth, colleagues who spoke of him as a man who knew how to take advantage of opportunity without ever admitting that he took advantage of people, and a former assistant who hesitated just long enough before describing a series of exclusive dinners Voss hosted, gatherings that were invitation-only and curiously undocumented, evenings where conversation was controlled, wine was expensive, and the guest list rotated in ways that never quite repeated. Heller dismissed this as social climbing until Stone asked the assistant what was served at these dinners, and she shrugged and said she never saw the kitchen, that the food arrived already prepared, that Voss insisted on a particular caterer whose name she could not recall, and it was in that shrug that Stone felt the shape of the case begin to form, not in facts yet, but in absence. The caterer, when found, was a shell company with no physical address, no staff, no invoices, beyond vague line items that suggested nothing more than specialty services. And when Stone traced those payments back, he found a pattern that led not to restaurants or suppliers, but to a private club near the waterfront, a place that advertised itself as a cultural society dedicated to experiential dining, a phrase that made Heller roll his eyes and made Stone uneasy in a way he could not articulate. The club, when they visited, was quiet to the point of sterility, its members moving through the space with a practiced discretion that felt less like politeness and more like complicity, and as Stone spoke with the manager, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes, he noticed the way conversations died as he passed, the way people watched not with curiosity but with calculation, as though assessing how much of him they could afford to lose. No evidence emerged that day, only impressions, only a lingering sense that this was not a place where crimes happened so much as a place where crimes were understood. And as Stone and Heller left, the fog rolled in heavier, swallowing the building until it seemed to vanish entirely, leaving nothing but the memory of a door that had closed behind them too softly. Back at the precinct, Stone reviewed the file alone, letting the city's ambient noise seep through the walls, the distant sirens, the typewriters, the low murmur of conversations that never quite stopped. And he thought about consumption, about how power in cities often looked like refinement, how cruelty learned to wear manners, and how men like Voss were praised not for what they created, but for what they absorbed. Another body surfaced 2 days later, similar profile, similar quiet collapse, another man whose life appeared enviable on paper and empty in practice, and the pattern, once glimpsed, could no longer be ignored, because these men knew each other, moved in overlapping circles, invested together, dined together, and spoke of philanthropy as though it were a seasoning sprinkled lightly over exploitation. Heller began to push harder, his impatience now sharpened by anger, while Stone slowed down, aware that whatever they were hunting would not respond well to pressure, that it would retreat behind ritual and language and the protective shield of respectability. And as Stone revisited the club under the guise of an invitation obtained through quiet favors, he found himself seated at a long table where conversation flowed smoothly and yet said nothing, where courses arrived without explanation, flavors rich and complex, leaving an aftertaste that was oddly unsettling, not because it was unpleasant but because it felt too complete, too final. And as Stone watched the diners savor each bite with reverent attention, he understood for the first time that the title he had scribbled in the margin of his notes, The Cannibals, was not metaphorical in the way he had hoped, that it described not an act but a philosophy, a way of moving through the world by consuming it entirely, people included. And as the evening wore on and the city pressed close against the windows, Stone felt the weight of the case settle into him, a knowledge that whatever truth lay beneath these dinners would not shock the city so much as confirm it, that San Francisco, for all its beauty, had always known how to eat its own and call it culture, and as he left the club, the fog wrapping around him like a curtain closing on the first act, he knew this was only the beginning, that the hunger he had sensed was far from satisfied, and that the streets would soon demand more than quiet collapses to keep their secret. By the time Inspector Mike Stone stepped back into the gray morning after that first private dinner, San Francisco no longer felt like a city he was walking through, but a body he was moving inside, veins of traffic pulsing beneath asphalt, breath rising from sewer grates like something exhaled in sleep, and what unsettled him most was not the suspicion of crime, but the certainty of consent. The sense that whatever was happening behind those polite doors was sustained not by secrecy alone, but by an unspoken agreement among people who benefited from silence. Stone carried this feeling with him into the precinct, where the clatter of daily police work went on as if insulated from darker truths, and when Steve Heller joined him at the desk, flipping open a folder with the eagerness of a man ready to punch through walls, Stone surprised him by saying very little, because the more he replayed the dinner in his mind, the careful pacing of the courses, the ceremonial way each plate was presented, the way diners spoke of sourcing and experience with a reverence usually reserved for religion, the more he understood that this case would not yield to speed or outrage, that it demanded patience, a willingness to let the cannibals reveal themselves through habit rather than confession. The lab results from the second victim came in that afternoon, matching the toxin found in Leonard Voss almost precisely, a compound synthesized to imitate natural failure while leaving the organs deceptively intact, and the pathologist, a man hardened by decades of bodies, admitted with discomfort that he had never seen it used outside of experimental research, which meant money, access, and a belief that consequences were negotiable. Eller slammed the file shut and asked who the hell would go to that much trouble just to kill men who were already killing themselves with excess. And Stone answered quietly that sometimes killing was not the point, that sometimes the point was control. The final act of ownership over people who believed they owned everything. The investigation widened, names pinned to boards, red string connecting investment firms, charity boards, art foundations, and that waterfront club that called itself a society. And as the web grew denser, Stone noticed something else, something almost elegant in its cruelty, that the victims were not random members of the elite, but men who had begun to fall out of favor, whose fortunes were slipping, whose influence was waning, men who had eaten well for years and were now being removed from the table. This realization shifted the case from murder to ritual, from crime to maintenance, and Stone felt an old weariness settle into his bones, the fatigue that came from recognizing a system that corrected itself by devouring its weakest contributors. Undercover work became unavoidable, and while Heller argued for an aggressive approach, Stone insisted on subtlety, arranging introductions through compromised intermediaries, cultivating the image of a discreet professional curious about membership, and it was during these maneuvers that he met Eleanor Fitch, a woman whose presence cut through rooms with quiet authority, whose wealth was old enough to appear modest, and whose interest in Stone seemed less personal than evaluative, as though she were weighing not his worth, but his usefulness. Eleanor spoke of the club not as a place, but as a philosophy, describing it as a refuge for those tired of vulgar consumption, those who sought purity and experience, and Stone listened carefully, aware that language was the true currency here, that words were used not to reveal but to bind, to signal belonging without ever articulating belief. He learned that dinners were only the outer layer, that beneath them were private gatherings, discussions framed as ethical debates about scarcity, sustainability, and the responsibility of those with power to decide who deserved to remain relevant. And Stone understood then that cannibalism, in this context, was intellectual before it was physical, a justification that allowed people to rationalize the destruction of others as necessity rather than desire. Another death followed, this one staged almost theatrically as an overdose in a hotel room overlooking Union Square, but the toxin told the same story. And Stone began to feel the pressure not only from the killers but from his own department, where whispers circulated about political connections, about donors who did not appreciate scrutiny, and about the wisdom of pursuing a case that seemed determined to implicate people whose names decorated buildings. Heller, sensing the walls closing in, grew reckless, pushing witnesses too hard, letting anger bleed into interviews, and Stone had to pull him aside, reminding him that this was not a fight they could win by being right, that they had to be precise, that every move needed to expose not just guilt but inevitability. It was Eleanor Fitch who finally offered Stone the key, though she did not know it herself. When during a conversation framed as philosophical, she remarked that consumption was the oldest law of nature, that predators maintained balance by removing the weak, and that humans were foolish to pretend otherwise, and Stone asked her, with deliberate innocence, who decided weakness. And she smiled in a way that felt like pity and said that decision was made collectively, through consensus among those capable of understanding the cost. And in that moment Stone saw the shape of the conspiracy clearly, not as a hierarchy but as a circle, each member both eater and eaten, sustained by the belief that participation guaranteed protection. Stone shared this insight with Heller late one night as the city outside the precinct windows dissolved into fog and neon, and for once Heller listened without interrupting, the weight of it settling in, the realization that they were not chasing a mastermind, but an idea that had learned to wear tuxedos and speak of ethics while quietly selecting victims. The challenge, Stone knew, would be proving intent, transforming philosophy into prosecutable fact, and as he returned to the club under deeper cover, attending a smaller, more intimate gathering, he noticed subtle changes, the way conversations tested him, the way questions circled around his views on decline and relevance. And when a dish was served that evening that carried a flavor disturbingly reminiscent of iron and smoke, Stone forced himself to eat, understanding that refusal would mark him as an outsider, that participation was the admission ticket to truth. The next morning, as he stood over yet another body, this one a former venture capitalist whose influence had evaporated almost overnight, Stone felt the city watching him, not with fear but with curiosity, as though wondering whether he would adapt or be consumed, and it was then that he resolved to stop reacting and begin shaping the endgame, knowing full well that whatever victory looked like, it would not leave him untouched, because you could not walk among cannibals without learning something uncomfortable about appetite, about how easily civilization justified hunger when it wore the right suit, and as the fog lifted briefly to reveal the bay, bright and indifferent, Stone understood that the streets of San Francisco had always been honest about one thing, that survival here was less about strength than about timing, about knowing when to step away from the table before you were served. Stone had learned over the years that the most dangerous moments in an investigation were not the violent ones, but the quiet stretches when the truth sat just out of reach, close enough to smell but still unprovable, and as part 3 of this unfolding nightmare took shape, San Francisco seemed determined to test that lesson. Because the city entered one of those deceptive lulls where nothing obvious happened, and yet everything shifted beneath the surface, like tectonic plates adjusting before an earthquake. The body stopped appearing for nearly 2 weeks, long enough for pressure to ease at the precinct and for certain unnamed figures to begin murmuring that perhaps the pattern had been exaggerated, that coincidence and stress could explain what ambition sometimes did to men, and Stone recognized the tactic immediately, the strategic pause that allowed predators to assess whether they were being watched, whether the cost of continuing outweighed the pleasure, and he knew that during such pauses the real work happened behind closed doors. Heller chafed under the inactivity, spending long nights buried in financial records, tracing shell companies that folded into trusts that folded into foundations, each layer designed not to hide wrongdoing, but to exhaust anyone trying to follow it. And when he finally slammed a stack of papers onto Stone's desk, pointing out that nearly all of the victims had recently voted against a particular restructuring proposal within a powerful investment consortium, Stone felt a slow click inside his mind, the sound of pieces locking together, because it confirmed what he had suspected, that the cannibals did not merely eliminate the weak, they eliminated dissent, and they did so under the guise of inevitability. Stone returned again to Eleanor Fitch, not as an interrogator but as a student, framing his visits as philosophical curiosity, letting her speak at length about decline, about how societies rotted from sentimentality, about how mercy, when extended too far, became waste, and he noticed how she never spoke of violence directly, how she described removal as though it were a natural process, pruning rather than killing, and in those conversations Stone understood that the true crime here was not murder but narrative, the construction of a story so convincing that those who benefited from it no longer saw blood when they acted. One evening, Eleanor invited Stone to a gathering that was not officially affiliated with the club, a private dinner held in a restored mansion overlooking the Presidio, a place where history itself seemed curated, and Stone accepted, knowing that proximity was the only way forward, that evidence would not be handed to him but leaked through ritual and habit. The guest list was smaller than before, the atmosphere more intimate, and as Stone took his seat at a long table polished to a mirror shine, he sensed that this was a threshold moment, that he was being weighed not for membership but for complicity, and he made a deliberate choice to speak less, to listen more, to let others reveal themselves in the spaces between words. Conversation that night turned toward scarcity, toward the limits of growth, toward the idea that too many voices diluted authority, and as wine flowed and courses arrived with reverent ceremony, one man, a financier whose name Stone recognized from the board, spoke openly about a former partner who had lost his edge, describing his decline with a detachment that bordered on affection, and when another guest remarked that it was merciful such men were spared the indignity of prolonged failure, Stone felt a chill despite the warmth of the room, because the implication hung there unchallenged, that death was a kindness when administered at the right moment by the right people. Later that evening, as dessert was served and the conversation drifted into art and legacy, Stone noticed something he had missed before, a pattern in the seating. The way certain guests were subtly centered, their opinions deferred to, while others orbited them like satellites, and he realized that the Cannibals did not operate as equals, that consensus was guided, shaped by a core who never appeared to lead, who allowed others to believe decisions emerged organically, and Stone cataloged faces, gestures, alliances, building a mental map more valuable than any document. The pause and killings ended abruptly with a death that felt almost defiant. A prominent developer found collapsed in a public park during a charity run, the irony sharp enough to draw headlines, and as Stone stood over the body, watching joggers diverted around yellow tape, he recognized the message. A reminder that the Cannibals could still act in daylight, could still turn public virtue into private disposal, and that they were not afraid of scrutiny, so long as it remained superficial. Pressure returned tenfold, city officials calling for swift conclusions, donors expressing concern about reputational harm, and within the department there were subtle shifts, assignments delayed, requests lost, a quiet resistance that told Stone he was no longer just investigating a crime but disrupting an economy of influence. Heller confronted him late one night, frustration spilling over, accusing Stone of letting philosophy distract from police work, of dining with suspects while the bodies piled up, and Stone listened patiently before explaining that arresting one or two participants would change nothing, that the idea would survive, that the system would adapt, and that what they needed was a fracture, something that would force the Cannibals to turn on themselves, to reveal their hunger openly. The opportunity came unexpectedly through weakness, not strength, when one of the peripheral members, a man named Charles Marrow, began to unravel, his business failing faster than anticipated, his invitations drying up, his presence tolerated rather than welcomed. And Stone sensed the familiar arc, the transition from eater to potential meal, and he positioned himself carefully, offering Marrow empathy without promise, listening as the man spoke of betrayal, of how loyalty in these circles was conditional, of how inclusion was always temporary, and when Marrow finally whispered that he feared being selected, Stone knew he had reached the point where fear pierced ideology. Gaining Marrow's cooperation was not a matter of threats, but of timing, of allowing him to understand that the system he had helped sustain would not spare him, and when Marrow finally agreed to wear a wire during an upcoming gathering, Stone felt the weight of the risk settle in, because exposure could trigger panic, could lead to violence or erasure, and yet it was the only path left. The gathering took place in a private dining room beneath the club, a space Stone had not seen before, more austere, stripped of pretense, and as Marrow sat among his peers, visibly tense, the conversation unfolded as Stone had predicted, subtle inquiries about relevance, about contribution, about whether Marrow still belonged, and when Eleanor Fitch spoke, gently but firmly, suggesting that some men knew when to step aside for the good of the whole, the room fell silent, the implication unmistakable, and Stone listened from his car as the wire transmitted every word, his jaw tightening as the philosophy he had studied crystallized into an unambiguous death sentence. The meeting ended without violence, because the cannibals did not rush their meals and Marrow survived the night, but the damage was done, the intent captured, the narrative exposed in voices that could no longer pretend innocence. Even so, Stone knew this was only the beginning of the end, that evidence alone would not be enough, that the city would resist swallowing the truth because it implicated not monsters but benefactors, not outsiders but pillars, and as dawn broke over San Francisco, painting the fog gold and pink, Stone felt both resolve and doubt intertwine, because he understood now that stopping the cannibals meant forcing the city to confront its own appetite, and cities, like people, rarely forgive those who hold up such mirrors. Yet he also knew that retreat would mean becoming what he hunted, another man who learned when to stay silent to survive, and as he prepared for the next phase, he accepted that whatever happened next would mark him permanently, because once you saw how power fed on itself, you could never again pretend that hunger was accidental, or that the streets were merely paved with chance rather than choice. The city did not erupt after the arrests. It adjusted, which was somehow worse, because adjustment implied acceptance, a recalibration of norms that allowed life to continue with only minor inconvenience. And as Stone watched San Francisco slide back into its routines, he felt the familiar bitterness that came with realizing how elastic morality became when stretched by money and reputation. Court proceedings began quietly, away from cameras whenever possible, and the initial wave of outrage dulled into a low, persistent murmur as lawyers argued nuance, intent, metaphor, and context, turning recorded words into philosophical exercises rather than preludes to death. And Stone attended these hearings not as a triumphant witness, but as an observer, taking note of which names vanished from transcripts, which affiliations were never mentioned, and which lines of questioning were gently redirected by judges who understood the invisible boundaries of inquiry. Heller grew increasingly vocal in his frustration, his patience eroded by what he saw as betrayal, and more than once Stone had to pull him back from confrontations that would have accomplished nothing but career suicide, reminding him that systems defended themselves best by provoking emotional responses they could later discredit. Charles Marrow, alive but deeply altered by the experience, withdrew from public life entirely, retreating into a kind of guarded anonymity that Stone recognized as survival rather than cowardice. And while Marrow's testimony remained valuable, Stone understood that his greatest contribution had already been made, that by refusing to die on schedule, he had disrupted a rhythm that relied on predictability. Eleanor Fitch, meanwhile, became a symbol, framed by opposing narratives either as a misunderstood intellectual or as the elegant face of monstrous privilege. And Stone found it unsettling how easily both images could coexist, how public discourse seemed comfortable, oscillating between extremes without settling on accountability. The club by the waterfront closed temporarily for renovations, a euphemism Stone had learned to distrust, and within weeks new entities emerged, differently named, similarly structured, proof that appetite simply relocated when threatened, and Stone documented these shifts meticulously, knowing that future cases would benefit from patterns even if this one never delivered the clarity he desired. Pressure mounted within the department for Stone to move on, to accept reassignment, to let the case cool, and his superiors framed this as concern for his well-being, for his longevity in a job that consumed men too completely. But Stone heard the subtext clearly, that persistence had diminishing returns when it made powerful people nervous. He complied outwardly, scaling back overt investigation, but inwardly he remained alert, maintaining informal contacts, listening more than acting, because he had learned that the cannibals thrived on attention as much as they feared it, and starving them of both was sometimes the most effective tactic. One evening, months after the arrests, Stone received a call from a source he trusted implicitly, a city planner whose office sat at the intersection of public policy and private influence, who spoke carefully but urgently about a new initiative being discussed in closed sessions, a proposal framed around urban renewal efficiency, targeting underperforming sectors, individuals, and communities deemed obstacles to progress. And as Stone listened, he felt the old chill return, because the language had evolved but the hunger remained, broader now, less personal, and far more dangerous. This shift troubled him deeply, because it suggested that the cannibal philosophy was maturing, moving away from ritualized elimination of individuals towards systemic erasure, policies that would displace and destroy without the need for poison or ceremony. And Stone realized that the dinners had been rehearsals, controlled environments where the idea could be tested among elites before being exported into governance. Heller, when Stone shared this insight, reacted with disbelief that quickly hardened into rage, arguing that they had barely survived confronting the private version of this ideology, that taking on its institutional form would be impossible, and Stone did not disagree. But he also knew that impossibility had never stopped harm before, it had only ensured it happened without resistance. Their partnership shifted subtly during this period, less about chasing suspects and more about comparing observations, about developing a shared language for recognizing predatory logic before it manifested as crime, and Stone valued this evolution, seeing in Heller a maturity forged not by success, but by disillusionment. A breakthrough of sorts came unexpectedly through Eleanor Fitch herself, who requested another meeting, this time without lawyers, without pretense, and Stone sensed that something in her had shifted, not remorse exactly, but recalculation, as though the exposure had forced her to reassess the balance between ideology and survival. She spoke candidly about fractures within the circle, about disagreements over scale and method, about how some believed the events Stone disrupted had been too crude, too vulnerable to misunderstanding. And Stone recognized the irony, that murder had not offended them nearly as much as publicity. Eleanor hinted at a schism, at members who wanted to retreat into safer abstractions and others who believed the time had come to formalize their philosophy into policy. And when Stone asked her why she was telling him this, she replied that survival required adaptation, and that adaptation sometimes meant shedding liabilities, a statement that made Stone acutely aware that he might now be part of her calculus. He left the meeting unsettled, because while the information was valuable, it came wrapped in self-interest, and he knew better than to mistake alignment for alliance. The months that followed were marked by absence rather than action, fewer deaths, fewer rituals, a conspicuous restraint that might have been mistaken for reform if Stone had not seen the long view, and he occupied himself with smaller cases, with the everyday violence that filled police blotters and rarely made headlines, grounding himself in tangible harm to offset the abstraction he had been swimming in. Yet the cannibals remained present in subtle ways, in zoning decisions that displaced vulnerable communities, in corporate mergers that quietly erased dissenting voices, in philanthropic campaigns that redirected resources away from those deemed inefficient. And Stone began to understand that the most successful predators did not need to kill anymore. They simply needed to define value. This realization weighed on him heavily, because it reframed his role entirely, turning him from a hunter of crimes into a witness of systems, and he struggled with the question of efficacy, of whether exposure mattered when appetite adapted so seamlessly. One night, walking alone through North Beach, the fog thick and intimate, Stone paused outside a restaurant window, watching diners laugh and eat, unaware or unconcerned with the philosophies shaping their city, and he felt a fleeting temptation to envy that ignorance, to step away from the table of knowledge before it consumed him. But the temptation passed quickly, replaced by a stubborn resolve born not of hope but of refusal. Heller articulated it best during a late-night conversation, saying that maybe they could not stop cannibals, but they could make feeding uncomfortable, could introduce friction where ease had once existed, and Stone recognized this as the truest measure of their work, not eradication but resistance. As the year drew toward its end, Stone documented everything, creating files not just for prosecution but for memory, a record meant to outlast political cycles and convenient forgetfulness. And while he did not know who would read them or when, he took comfort in the act itself, In the belief that naming patterns was a form of defiance, the streets of San Francisco continued their eternal performance, beauty and brutality coexisting without apology, and Stone moved through them with a quiet acceptance of ambiguity, aware that justice here was rarely clean or complete, but also aware that surrender came disguised as pragmatism, and he had seen enough of that. The cannibals had not been defeated, not truly, but they had been seen, forced into the light long enough to cast shadows of their own, and Stone carried that knowledge forward, knowing it would inform every case that followed, every decision about where to look and when to push, because once you understood how power fed, you could never again pretend that decline was natural or that some people simply vanished by accident. And as he stood one evening overlooking the bay, the lights of the city shimmering like something alive, Stone acknowledged a hard truth, that the fight against cannibalism was not a single case or era but an ongoing negotiation between appetite and conscience, one that demanded vigilance rather than victory, and while that realization offered no comfort, it gave him clarity, and in a city built on reinvention, clarity was a rare and valuable thing. By the time spring fully claimed San Francisco, the city wore renewal like a carefully rehearsed smile, blossoms softening streets that had recently displaced entire lives, sunlight glinting off glass towers whose reflections concealed as much as they revealed, and Stone felt increasingly aware that seasons, like narratives, were often used to suggest progress where none truly existed. Officially, his work had narrowed to routine cases again, assaults, robberies, the visible crimes that reassured the public that danger was loud and easily identified. But beneath this surface rhythm, Stone continued to trace the quieter violence, the kind that arrived with permits and studies instead of sirens, and he sensed that the cannibals, having survived exposure, were entering a more confident phase, one marked not by secrecy but by normalization. The Task Force on Strategic Urban Resilience convened its first public sessions, carefully choreographed to project transparency, and Stone attended as an observer, sitting among journalists and concerned citizens, watching familiar faces adopt the posture of civic duty, their language scrubbed clean of the sharper edges he had once heard behind closed doors, and he noted how questions were answered with reassurance rather than substance, how complexity was used as a shield against accountability. Heller joined him at one such session, leaning close to murmur that it felt like watching predators learn to graze in daylight, and Stone understood the metaphor immediately, because what frightened him most was not the content of the proposals, but their reception, the way applause followed statements that promised efficiency at the expense of empathy, the way fear of decline made people willing to accept consumption as policy. Outside the hearing rooms, Stone's quiet alliances deepened, particularly with community organizers and mid-level bureaucrats who recognized the damage being done but lacked the power to halt it alone, and these conversations grounded him, reminding him that resistance rarely announced itself dramatically, that it often took the form of persistence, of refusing to let language drift unchallenged. One such ally, a housing analyst disillusioned with the misuse of data, shared internal drafts of reports that revealed how conclusions were predetermined, how metrics were selected not to measure reality, but to justify outcomes already decided, and as Stone read through these documents late into the night, he felt the same chill he had felt listening to dinner conversations months earlier, because the logic was identical, the removal of variables deemed inefficient, the quiet acceptance that loss was an acceptable byproduct of progress. Eleanor Fitch remained a constant, distant presence, her influence diffused now through committees and advisory roles rather than private salons. And Stone wondered whether she saw this evolution as success or compromise, because power, he had learned, rarely mourned the loss of intimacy if it gained scale in return. A moment of unexpected clarity arrived during a routine homicide investigation unrelated to the cannibals, a crime born of desperation rather than design, and as Stone interviewed witnesses in a cramped apartment scheduled for demolition, he was struck by the contrast, by how visible and condemned this violence was compared to the sanctioned harm unfolding across the city, and it reinforced his conviction that justice was not blind but selectively sighted, trained to notice only what it was comfortable punishing. This realization hardened into resolve when Stone received word that charges against several peripheral members of the original dining circle were being quietly reduced, their cooperation rewarded with leniency that bordered on erasure. And while this maneuver was justified as pragmatism, Stone recognized it as appetite adapting once more, consuming risk to preserve the core. Heller reacted with bitterness, remarking that the cannibals were being allowed to digest their own exposure, and Stone could not disagree, but he also cautioned against despair, reminding him that every adaptation left traces, that systems which consumed constantly also shed evidence in the form of patterns, and it was these patterns that would eventually matter. Tension escalated when a whistleblower within the task force reached out anonymously, providing recordings of internal discussions where members spoke more candidly about acceptable losses, about neighborhoods viewed as expendable buffers, and Stone listened carefully, noting how easily human lives were reduced to variables, how familiar the cadence was, the same calm certainty he had heard at the table when Marrow's fate had been discussed. This material was explosive in implication, if not yet in legal weight, and Stone faced another familiar dilemma, whether to push it into the light and risk its dilution, or to hold it until it could be contextualized within a broader narrative that made denial more difficult. He chose patience, a decision that did not come easily, because patience felt too much like waiting while harm continued, but he understood now that premature exposure often strengthened those it targeted, allowing them to absorb impact without changing course. During this period, Stone noticed subtle shifts in his own psychology, a growing detachment that worried him, moments where outrage gave way to analysis so quickly it felt mechanical, and he questioned whether prolonged proximity to predatory logic risked internalizing it, turning vigilance into cynicism, and this self-awareness became another axis of struggle, because resisting cannibalism required not just external opposition but internal discipline. Conversations with Heller became less about strategy and more about values. Late-night exchanges where they spoke candidly about limits, about the toll of fighting battles that never truly ended. And Heller admitted that part of him longed for simpler cases, for villains who did not justify themselves so elegantly, and Stone shared this sentiment, recognizing it as grief for a moral clarity that adulthood and experience steadily eroded. A public setback arrived when a major redevelopment proposal passed despite organized opposition, its approval celebrated as a triumph of foresight. And Stone watched the press conference with a heaviness he could not shake because he saw in the smiling officials the same satisfaction he had once seen at the dinner table, the pleasure of consumption framed as responsibility. Yet even in this moment, resistance flickered, not loudly but persistently, as community groups documented displacement, as journalists followed threads Stone and others had quietly provided, as questions began to surface about whose resilience was truly being prioritized. And Stone understood that while the cannibals controlled momentum, they did not control meaning entirely. Eleanor Fitch crossed his path again unexpectedly at a public charity event, and their brief exchange was polite, almost cordial, but beneath it Stone sensed mutual recognition, an acknowledgement that they now operated in parallel awareness, each understanding the other's role without illusion. And as she spoke of balance and difficult choices, Stone responded by asking gently who is allowed to choose. And for a fraction of a second, her composure faltered, enough to confirm that even refined appetite carried unease. The weeks that followed were marked by an intensification of scrutiny from unseen quarters, Stone's access subtly restricted, his requests delayed, and he interpreted this not as a threat, but as confirmation that his presence still mattered, that friction had been introduced into a system that preferred smooth operation, and he took solace in that, however small it seemed. Heller, ever more pragmatic, suggested that perhaps the measure of success here was survival, that staying in the fight long enough to witness shifts mattered more than dramatic wins, and Stone found this perspective both sobering and sustaining, because it reframed endurance as agency rather than compromise. As summer approached, bringing with it the promise of movement and change, Stone stood one evening atop a hill overlooking neighborhoods at different stages of consumption, some already hollowed out, others newly targeted, and he reflected on how cannibalism, in its most evolved form, rarely announced itself as cruelty, preferring to speak of inevitability and improvement, and how dangerous such language was precisely because it appealed to reason. He acknowledged that part 7 of this story was not about confrontation but about recognition, about learning to see appetite in its most socially acceptable forms, and about cultivating the patience to respond without becoming what one opposed. The streets below hummed with life, oblivious and resilient in equal measure, and Stone felt again that complicated blend of sorrow and determination, aware that the fight he was engaged in had no clean ending, only chapters of resistance and adaptation, and as he turned away from the view, he carried with him a quiet commitment to remain attentive, to question language, to stand with those being consumed rather than those doing the consuming, because in a city that prided itself on reinvention, memory itself had become a radical act, and Stone intended to remember, even when forgetting was easier, even when silence promised comfort, because once you recognized cannibalism not as an act but as a habit of power, looking away was no longer an option without cost. Autumn crept into San Francisco with its usual contradiction, mornings sharp enough to wake the bones and afternoons that softened into a deceptive warmth, and Stone sensed that the season suited the Cannibals' next phase perfectly, because fall was about harvest, about collecting what had been patiently cultivated, and he could feel that something was ripening beneath the surface of policy briefings and public reassurances. The delayed redevelopment project that had briefly stalled was back on the agenda, rebranded and repackaged with enough cosmetic changes to satisfy casual observers, and Stone understood that this was not stubbornness but strategy. The predators had learned that retreat was useful only insofar as it enabled a stronger return. The local paper that had run the investigative piece now published a softer follow-up, highlighting concessions and compromises, and while nothing in it was false, Stone recognized the familiar sleight of hand, the narrowing of focus so that structural harm dissolved into a series of manageable adjustments. Heller, increasingly frustrated, suggested escalating matters, pushing for a broader exposé that connected multiple projects under a single ideological umbrella, but Stone hesitated, aware that scale could be both weapon and liability, because to name the system too explicitly risked activating its defenses in full, and he was not yet certain they had the evidence to withstand that pressure. Instead, Stone continued to map relationships, tracing how advisory boards overlapped, how consultants rotated through public and private roles, how philanthropic initiatives dovetailed neatly with displacement timelines, and this cartography of influence began to resemble a circulatory system, nutrients flowing to the same organs regardless of the entry point. One name appeared again and again, not Eleanor Fitch's this time, but a lesser-known figure, a policy architect who rarely appeared on camera, yet authored the language that others recited, and Stone felt the old investigative thrill stir, the recognition of a mind shaping events from behind the curtain. Approaching this figure required subtlety, because power exercised quietly often bristled at direct scrutiny, and Stone opted for indirect engagement, attending lectures, reading op-eds, noting rhetorical patterns. And what emerged was a worldview that framed society as a set of competing efficiencies, moral questions reduced to throughput and waste, and Stone realized that cannibalism, at this level, had fully internalized its own logic, seeing consumption not as violence but as optimization. Meanwhile, community resistance evolved, no longer limited to protests or meetings but manifesting as alternative networks, cooperatives, legal clinics, and Stone found hope in these adaptive responses because they represented not just opposition but invention, a refusal to define survival solely in reaction to predation. Attending a cooperative's opening in the Mission, Stone listened to residents speak about reclaiming agency, and while their resources were modest, their clarity of purpose struck him as something the Cannibals could not easily absorb because it resisted abstraction, grounded instead in lived experience. Eleanor Fitch appeared less frequently in Stone's immediate field of vision, but her influence remained palpable, and when she did resurface, it was through an unexpected channel, a private invitation to a small roundtable discussion on ethical urban futures, and Stone debated whether to attend, aware that participation could legitimize a process designed to neutralize dissent, yet absence risked ceding the space entirely. He chose to go, approaching the event as an observer rather than a collaborator, and there, amid polite discourse and curated disagreement, he saw how the cannibals practiced containment, allowing limited critique within parameters they controlled, and when Stone raised a pointed question about accountability mechanisms, the response was swift but smooth, redirecting towards shared values and long-term vision, and he understood that this was the table where dissent was softened into seasoning. After the event, Eleanor spoke to him privately for the first time in months, her tone cordial, her words carefully chosen, and she acknowledged his concerns while subtly questioning his assumptions, suggesting that resistance often underestimated complexity, and Stone noted how she framed complexity as a deterrent to moral clarity, and he replied calmly that complexity did not absolve harm, and while the exchange remained civil, he sensed a shift, a recognition that he was not merely a nuisance, but a persistent variable. Shortly thereafter, access tightened further, and Stone found himself excluded from certain briefings he had previously attended, a quiet demotion in influence that confirmed Eleanor's reach, without her having to exercise it overtly. This marginalization forced Stone to rely more heavily on informal networks, and it was through one such connection that he obtained internal correspondence revealing that the revised redevelopment plan still projected displacement rates nearly identical to the original, with mitigation strategies designed primarily to manage optics rather than outcomes. Reviewing these documents late one night, Stone felt a familiar mix of anger and resolve, and he realized that part 9 of the story was about thresholds, about recognizing when patience became complicity if allowed to stretch indefinitely. Heller, upon seeing the correspondence, argued passionately for immediate release, but Stone proposed a different tactic, a targeted disclosure to affected communities first, empowering them with information before the narrative could be framed for them, and after intense debate, they agreed. The response from the communities was swift and visceral, not explosive but organized, and Stone watched as residents who had previously felt isolated began coordinating across neighborhoods, sharing resources and strategies, and he saw in this the cannibals' greatest vulnerability, not exposure but solidarity. Media attention followed, but this time the framing was less easily controlled because first-hand voices disrupted the usual expert commentary, and Stone took cautious satisfaction in this shift. Knowing it could be temporary, but valuing it nonetheless, the cannibals adapted again, offering concessions, extending timelines, proposing pilot programs, and Stone recognized these as pressure release valves, designed to diffuse momentum without altering direction, and he advised community leaders accordingly, emphasizing vigilance over celebration. Personally, Stone felt the strain deepen, his sense of identity increasingly tied to opposition, and he questioned whether he had become defined by the cannibals' existence, and whether there was a risk in allowing one's moral compass to be set solely in reaction to appetite. A conversation with an old colleague, now retired, offered perspective, as the man reminded Stone that systems outlast individuals, and that resistance was less about victory than about continuity, about ensuring that future actors inherited both memory and method. This resonated deeply, and Stone began documenting not just events but processes, creating a record that could be used by others long after his involvement waned. Eleanor Fitch's philanthropic initiative expanded, garnering praise and awards, and Stone observed how accolades functioned as armor, deflecting critique by associating her name with benevolence, and he understood that cannibalism at this level depended on reputation management as much as on consumption, and he resolved to treat reputation itself as a terrain of struggle, to be neither blindly accepted nor cynically dismissed. As autumn advanced and daylight receded, Stone felt the narrative tightening, threads converging toward a confrontation that might not be dramatic but would be decisive in subtler ways, and he prepared himself for the possibility that Part 9 would not end in resolution but in redefinition, a shift from reactive investigation to proactive cultivation of alternatives. Standing one evening on Twin Peaks, watching the city glow beneath a veil of mist, Stone reflected on how San Francisco had always been a city of cycles, boom and bust, idealism and exploitation, and he understood that the cannibals were not an aberration but an iteration, more refined, more eloquent, yet bound by the same fundamental hunger. What mattered, he realized, was not eliminating hunger but challenging the belief that it must be satisfied at any cost, and as he descended the hill, lights blurring into lines, he felt a steadier resolve take hold, quieter than anger, more durable than hope, grounded in the knowledge that even refined predators left traces, and that as long as someone remained willing to notice, to remember, and to connect those traces into meaning, the feast would never be entirely invisible. Part 9 closed not with triumph or defeat but with alignment, Stone finding clarity in his role not as a hero or a gatekeeper, but as a witness who refused to be domesticated by complexity, and in that refusal, he sensed the slow accumulation of a different kind of power, one that did not consume but endured, waiting for the moment when appetite finally overreached and the city, weary of being eaten, might listen more closely to those who had never stopped watching. Winter announced itself in San Francisco not with snow but with a sharpening of edges, conversations turning brisk, patience thinning, and Stone felt that the city itself had entered a phase of exposure, the way bare branches revealed structures hidden all summer, and he sensed that the cannibals, too, were becoming more visible even as they refined their camouflage. The coalition of communities that had formed after the targeted disclosures continued to evolve, no longer reactive but strategic, scheduling meetings not just to protest but to plan, and Stone found himself less a detective and more an archivist of intent, documenting how power responded when confronted not with outrage but with coordination. The task force, under mounting scrutiny, released a comprehensive winter report framed as transparency, yet as Stone read through its pages, he recognized the familiar technique of saturation, overwhelming the reader with data so that meaning dissolved in volume, and he noted how key metrics were aggregated just enough to obscure localized harm. Heller, ever impatient with obfuscation, argued that this flood of information was itself an admission of vulnerability, and Stone agreed, adding that cannibals only bothered to disguise themselves when they sensed a credible audience. The lesser-known policy architect emerged more clearly during this period, publishing a widely circulated essay on adaptive urban ethics, and Stone dissected it line by line, identifying how moral language was used to preempt critique, how responsibility was distributed so diffusely that no single actor could be held accountable, and he shared this analysis quietly with organizers, who found in it a vocabulary to counter the rhetoric that had long disarmed them. Eleanor Fitch, sensing perhaps that the narrative was slipping beyond her control, shifted tone noticeably, her public appearances more defensive, her emphasis on partnership more insistent, and Stone noted that when predators feel cornered, they often attempt to redefine the terms of engagement, inviting critics into processes designed to exhaust rather than empower. One such invitation arrived in the form of a closed-door advisory session on winter housing stability, and this time Stone declined to attend, advising others to do the same, recognizing that refusal itself could be a statement, and the absence of dissenting voices created a vacuum that was immediately filled with self-congratulation, a spectacle that later drew quiet ridicule when outcomes failed to materialize. Winter storms brought practical crises, power outages, flooded basements, and Stone observed how these emergencies exposed the fragility of systems optimized for efficiency rather than resilience, and he saw how cannibal logic faltered when conditions deviated from projections because appetite thrived on predictability. Community networks stepped in where official responses lagged, distributing supplies, checking on the elderly, and Stone felt a surge of respect for this parallel infrastructure, understanding that it represented not an alternative policy, but an alternative ethic, one rooted in proximity rather than abstraction. This contrast did not go unnoticed by the cannibals, who began incorporating language of mutual aid into their communications. And Stone watched with a mixture of irony and concern as grassroots concepts were repackaged for institutional consumption, stripped of their disruptive potential. A significant development occurred when an internal whistleblower from within the redevelopment firm reached out anonymously, providing documentation that confirmed long-suspected coordination between philanthropic initiatives and displacement schedules, and as Stone reviewed the material, he felt the narrative tighten further, because this evidence bridged the gap between intention and outcome too clearly to be dismissed as coincidence. Protecting the source became paramount, and Stone coordinated with legal advocates to ensure anonymity, aware that cannibals rarely retaliated overtly, preferring subtler forms of erasure, career stagnation, reputational whispers, and he understood that safeguarding witnesses was as critical as exposing harm. The release of this information was handled with deliberate pacing, shared first with trusted journalists known for restraint rather than sensationalism, and the resulting coverage was measured yet damning, focusing on process rather than personality, and Stone felt a cautious satisfaction in seeing complexity used not as a shield but as a lens. Backlash followed swiftly, accusations of selective disclosure, of undermining economic recovery during a fragile winter, and Stone noted how crisis was invoked to silence critique, a pattern as old as governance itself. Eleanor Fitch responded publicly with a statement emphasizing her commitment to ethical outcomes, and while she did not deny the coordination outright, she framed it as alignment of values, and Stone recognized this as an attempt to normalize what had been concealed, to transform revelation into inevitability. Privately, pressure intensified. Stone's access reduced further, funding for certain community programs threatened, and he understood that the cannibals were testing whether resistance could withstand material strain, because hunger, after all, was a powerful motivator, and deprivation could erode solidarity faster than ideology. Conversations with organizers grew heavier, balancing moral resolve against immediate needs, and Stone found himself grappling with the ethics of endurance, questioning how much burden could justly be placed on those already marginalized, and he realized that Part 10 was forcing a reckoning not just with systems, but with the limits of resistance itself. A turning point came during a winter hearing where affected residents testified directly before city officials, and Stone watched as stories cut through procedural language, moments of raw clarity disrupting the script, and for a brief interval, the cannibals' polished rhetoric faltered, revealing discomfort, and Stone understood that while appetite could absorb data, it struggled with narrative that refused abstraction. This discomfort manifested later in procedural maneuvers, hearings adjourned, decisions deferred, and while cynics dismissed this as stalling, Stone saw in delay a crack, a disruption of momentum that mattered more than symbolic votes. The policy architect attempted to reassert narrative control through a follow-up essay on participatory governance, and Stone noticed how it subtly recast testimony as consultation, transforming lived experience into input, and he shared this observation with journalists, who began questioning the language more openly, and Stone felt the slow shift of discourse, not dramatic but cumulative. Personally, winter weighed on him, the shortened days amplifying fatigue, and he questioned whether vigilance had become habit rather than choice, and whether stepping back might restore perspective. Yet every attempt at disengagement was interrupted by new developments, and he accepted that this season required presence, not balance. A brief, unexpected encounter with Eleanor Fitch at a charity event underscored this reality, as she approached him with an expression that mixed weariness and resolve, acknowledging the difficulty of the moment without conceding ground, and Stone sensed that she, too, was navigating pressures from above and below, a reminder that cannibal systems consumed their own intermediaries as readily as their prey. This recognition did not soften his opposition but complicated it, reinforcing his belief that the true adversary was not individuals but logics, and that dismantling a logic required patience beyond a single career or campaign. As winter deepened, the city entered a lull, not of resolution but of recalibration. Projects paused, rhetoric cooled, and Stone used this interval to consolidate knowledge, organizing documents, timelines, and testimonies into a coherent archive, aware that memory was fragile and easily overwritten by the next cycle of urgency. This act of consolidation felt almost meditative, a counterpoint to months of reaction, and Stone sensed that he was preparing for a phase beyond exposure, one that might involve reconstruction rather than resistance. Walking through neighborhoods under gray skies, he observed how life persisted in small rituals, coffee shops reopening after storms, children playing in puddles, and he drew strength from these continuities, understanding that cannibals thrived on rupture, on convincing people that displacement was the only constant. Part 10, he realized, was about wintering, about surviving the cold without surrendering principles, about holding ground when growth narratives lost their luster. And as the year edged toward its end, Stone felt neither victorious nor defeated but steadied, anchored by the knowledge that systems built on appetite eventually confronted limits, and that endurance, unglamorous and quiet, was itself a form of resistance. Standing one evening beneath streetlights haloed by mist, he reflected that the cannibals had refined their methods to near invisibility, but invisibility was not invincibility, and as long as witnesses remained, as long as memory was curated rather than allowed to scatter, the city retained the possibility of choosing differently. And with that thought, Stone closed his notebook, not as an ending but as a pause, aware that what followed winter was not resolution but renewal, contested and uncertain, and that part 10 marked the threshold between surviving appetite and imagining what might come after it. Early summer settled over San Francisco with a deceptive calm, the kind that suggested resolution without ever quite delivering it, and Stone sensed that this final movement of the story would not arrive as a climax but as a convergence, threads tightening not into a knot but into a weave, durable precisely because it refused the illusion of finality. The city, restless and radiant, moved forward with its habitual confidence, yet beneath the visible momentum lay a new texture of resistance, not loud enough to dominate headlines, but steady enough to alter trajectories, and Stone recognized this as the aftereffect of constraint. Appetite slowed, redirected, made to negotiate with memory rather than devour it. The archive he had built now lived beyond him, mirrored across secure drives, held by organizers, journalists, and advocates who understood not just its contents but its logic. And this diffusion of custody felt like a quiet victory because cannibal systems depended on bottlenecks of knowledge, and he had helped dissolve one. Heller, preparing for a transfer out of the city, met Stone for coffee near North Beach, and their conversation was less about cases than about aftermath, about how rarely justice arrived as closure, and Heller admitted that this investigation had altered his understanding of harm, shifting it from singular acts to cumulative processes, and Stone felt a deep, understated satisfaction in that admission because influence, when it mattered, often registered privately rather than publicly. Eleanor Fitch remained present in the civic imagination, her image subtly transformed by months of pressure, no longer the unchallenged emblem of ethical growth, but a contested figure navigating a narrowed path, and Stone observed from a distance as she attempted to institutionalize reforms, some meaningful, others symbolic, and he accepted that her trajectory would likely remain ambiguous, a testament to how systems absorbed reformers without necessarily reforming themselves. The policy architect retreated temporarily from public view, resurfacing only through measured commentary, and Stone interpreted this withdrawal not as defeat, but as recalibration, a reminder that cannibals rarely vanished, they learned, waiting for conditions to favor their return. Community coalitions, however, continued to meet, now less frequently but more deliberately, shifting from crisis response to stewardship, discussing zoning language, legal precedents, and generational housing strategies, and Stone attended when invited, speaking less and listening more, aware that his role was transitioning from catalyst to custodian. One afternoon, while reviewing notes from a neighborhood assembly, he realized that the vocabulary had changed, displacement no longer framed as inevitable but as negotiable, accountability no longer an abstraction but a demand with names and dates attached, and this linguistic shift struck him as profound because cannibalism thrived on inevitability, and language was where inevitability was either enforced or dismantled. The city council passed a revised package of measures incorporating some of the constraints fought for over the past year, modest yet enforceable, and Stone watched the vote with tempered expectations, understanding that policy was not a safeguard but a terrain, yet he allowed himself a moment of acknowledgement, recognizing the distance traveled from unchecked appetite to conditional growth. Media narratives reflected this ambivalence, no longer celebratory nor wholly cynical, and Stone sensed a maturation in coverage, a willingness to hold contradictions without rushing to resolution, and he took this as another sign that the city had learned, if not wisdom, then caution. Personally, Stone confronted the question he had postponed for months: what came after vigilance? And he tested the idea of stepping back, declining invitations, spending days without scanning agendas or tracking rhetoric, and at first the absence felt disorienting, like a muscle unused, but gradually it revealed a space he had forgotten existed, one where the city could be experienced without immediate analysis. Walking through Chinatown at dusk, lanterns glowing softly, he felt a surge of affection unmediated by critique, and he understood that resistance, to be sustainable, required periodic surrender to ordinary joy, not as denial but as nourishment. Yet even in these moments, memory persisted, not as burden but as orientation, and Stone realized that the goal had never been to forget the cannibals, but to prevent their logic from monopolizing perception. Eleanor Fitch reached out once more, indirectly, proposing a retrospective conversation for a civic journal, and Stone declined again, but this time without tension, recognizing that refusal no longer carried the weight it once did, because the work had moved beyond dialogue into structure, and he felt a quiet closure in that boundary. The archive continued to circulate, cited in policy debates, referenced in academic work, and Stone watched with a detached pride as interpretations multiplied, understanding that once knowledge entered the commons, it escaped singular authorship, and this dispersal mirrored the ethic he had come to value most: shared responsibility. A small but telling incident underscored the shift. When a proposed redevelopment was preemptively revised after community groups invoked precedents established earlier in the year, and Stone noted how appetite had learned to anticipate resistance, moderating itself not out of conscience but calculation, and while this was hardly redemption, it represented a tangible alteration in behavior. Heller's departure marked a personal transition, and as Stone watched his friend leave the city, he reflected on how investigations ended not with arrests or confessions, but with people carrying altered frameworks into new contexts, and he took comfort in that continuity. Summer festivals filled the streets, music spilling into the evenings, and Stone allowed himself to participate, not as observer but as citizen, dancing awkwardly, laughing, feeling the pulse of a city that had endured countless cycles of exploitation and renewal, and he acknowledged that San Francisco's resilience lay not in its institutions, but in its inhabitants' stubborn insistence on belonging. The cannibals, he knew, would adapt again, refining language, shifting strategies, seeking new seams to exploit, but they would encounter a city marginally less naive, marginally more prepared, and Stone accepted that marginal gains, accumulated over time, constituted a form of progress rarely celebrated but deeply consequential. Reflecting on the journey, he understood that his initial metaphor of cannibalism had evolved, no longer a shocking accusation but a diagnostic tool, a way to name patterns of consumption that masqueraded as care, and he recognized the responsibility embedded in naming, because metaphors shaped perception, and perception guided action. The final pages of his notebook filled with reflections rather than evidence, observations about how power reacted to constraint, how narratives shifted under pressure, how resistance required both rigor and generosity, and writing these thoughts felt like an act of release, a closing of a chapter rather than a sealing of a case. Standing at Ocean Beach one evening, wind whipping off the Pacific, Stone watched waves break and recede endlessly, and the rhythm offered a fitting image for what he had learned, that appetite and resistance were tidal forces, advancing and retreating, never resolved, only managed through attention and collective memory. He acknowledged the temptation to frame this story as a moral arc bending toward justice, but he resisted it, choosing instead to see it as a spiral, revisiting familiar terrain with altered awareness, each pass offering the possibility of different choices. Part 12, he realized, was not an ending but a handoff, the work continuing through others, through institutions slightly reshaped, through language sharpened by experience, and he felt a rare peace in accepting that his contribution was finite yet sufficient. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky streaked with color, Stone closed his notebook for the last time, not because there was nothing left to record, but because recording was no longer his primary task, and he trusted that the habit of witnessing had taken root elsewhere. The cannibals would remain, because systems built on appetite did not vanish, but they would no longer feast unnoticed, and that, he understood, was the quiet, unglamorous victory available to those who refused silence. The city hummed behind him, alive, contradictory, unfinished. And Stone turned away from the water with a sense of measured completion, knowing that the true ending of this story would be written not in reports or reforms, but in the daily choices of people who had learned, through struggle, to recognize hunger even when it spoke gently, and to answer it not with submission but with memory, coordination, and care. And in that recognition, he found something like hope, stripped of illusion, yet stubborn enough to endure.